This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel suffers its deadliest day in the current wave of violence, while in Paris, France mourns its dead, tracks down ISIS terrorists, and declares war on the Islamic State after the worst terror attack on French soil since World War II. Israel says it will stand shoulder to shoulder with France, while the U.S. braces for a possible terror attack inside its borders. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell, coming to you this week from the scene of one of the latest terror attacks inside Israel. In just one day, 5 died in 2 separate terror attacks, including an American teenager who came to volunteer and study. American Ezra Schwartz came to Israel to join a program co-sponsored by the Jewish Agency and the Israeli government. The head of the Jewish Agency, Natan Sharansky, found his death even more tragic because Schwartz came to be part of the vibrant Israeli experience. A 24-year-old Palestinian terrorist from nearby Hebron drove up in this lane of traffic and began shooting into the next lane with an automatic rifle. He killed Ezra, a Palestinian, an Israeli, and wounded 7 others. This video caught the aftermath when Israeli police surrounded the terrorist. Earlier in the day, 2 more Israelis died in Tel Aviv when 36-year-old Raed Mahmoud walked into a synagogue and began randomly stabbing worshipers during afternoon prayers. He worked in a restaurant next door. Hamas praised both of the attacks that came almost 1 year to the day after a major terror attack on a Jerusalem synagogue that killed 4 during morning prayers. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the terrorists will pay a price for these attacks, and Israeli officials continue to blame incitement by the Palestinian Authority and its political party, Fatah. Fatah recently held a rally honoring the terrorists responsible for the first 2 murders in this current wave of violence. Republican presidential candidate Ted Cruz tweeted that the Palestinian Arab terrorism is simply the same radical Islam as ISIS. Many Israelis agree.
Just as the attacks in Paris and just as previously in London, Madrid and New York, the Islamist radical terrorists just want to kill us, not because of what we do, not because of where we live, because of who we are. And Jews and Christians around the world are on the front lines.
Days after the Paris terror attacks, France is still dealing with the worst terror attack on its soil since World War II. 129 died, hundreds more were wounded, many of them seriously. But as Dale Hurd reports, many French analysts have been warning about such an attack for a very long time.
Paris today is a city still in shock and afraid. This woman says, yes, I'm scared. I'm scared for me, for my children, for my family, for my friends. But we have to stay strong and united. It's important.
We're scared, but we know we have to fight back, and the only way to fight back is to keep on living the way we live.
And while ISIS has claimed responsibility, the emphasis on the attack originating in Syria obscures the fact that most of the attackers were French and Belgian citizens. The enemy is within. After the Charlie Hebdo and kosher supermarket massacre, CBN News interviewed French conservatives who warned that a stronger attack like last Friday's was a certainty because the French government was still more concerned with political correctness than security. French TV commentator Eric Zemmour was fired after Charlie Hebdo for saying that Muslims should be deported to avoid chaos and civil war. Just recently, Marine Le Pen, the leader of France's right-wing Front National, went on trial for hate speech after she compared Muslims praying in the streets to the Nazi occupation. And after Charlie Hebdo, her former advisor, Emmerich Choprada, got in trouble for saying that France is at war with some French Muslims.
We have to fight very firmly, very strictly against the Islamization of the French society. There is an Islamization process, and we have to stop it clearly.
And after Charlie Hebdo, we heard a similar warning about France's future.
I see civil war, and I'm not a prophet, you know. It's obvious, it's Lebanon.
Civil war, that's clear.
Civil war, as terrible as it would be, civil war is a wrong expression, there would be nothing civil about it.
And what happened Friday in Paris certainly looked a step closer to that. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
We talk more with Dale from CBN News headquarters from our Jerusalem studio. Dale, you've been reporting in Europe and specifically on France for a number of years, and you say that France should have seen this coming. Why do you say that?
Because a lot of the French saw this coming, but the political class continues to be in denial and was hoping it wouldn't happen. But we've been running our story after this attack, sound bites from after Charlie Hebdo, where people were predicting that France's future was civil war. I think the French all kind of expected this, but they're so paralyzed by PC that they didn't do what was necessary.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's any sign France has learned its lesson right now and it's really going to deal with the threat that really the enemy is within France right now?
They're still treating this like a crime instead of an ideological war. So if you can imagine if it was Italy and the mafia and they're making raids and going after people and it's a police action. But at the same time, the government of France is helping to spread radical Islam around the country. We've shown this. I was in one of my stories standing at a mosque in Paris, financed by the city of Paris, and the name in Arabic meaning conquest. The name of the mosque was Conquest, and it was being funded by the French government.
Many French analysts are saying there's a civil war coming. Do you believe that's true?
I think it is in the long view. What these immigrants are importing from the Middle East is Lebanon, a country in which you have forces that not only disagree with each other, but want to kill each other. And it's particularly perilous for Jews because so many of these immigrants coming in have anti-Semitic views.
And you mentioned the Jews. Do you think we're going to see an acceleration of Jewish immigration out of France and many times here to Israel?
Yeah, almost certainly. And I think just the whole migrant invasion, the whole huge migrant influx, they see the writing on the wall. This is going to be a new constituent in several European nations. Next week, we'll be highlighting the Jews in Belgium and the fear that they live on, and the fact that Jews in Europe today, what we'll be showing is have to hide their Jewishness when they're out in public. And many of them treat this like it's normal, and it's not. This sounds dire, but it's the beginning of the end.
Wow. Pretty chilling. Finally, Dale, do you think there's any way that France can stop these attacks?
I think more people have to die. Sarkozy is saying that Hollande should have resigned after this. So little was done to actually attack the sources of this terror. Again, it's treated like a crime problem instead of an ideologically driven threat.
What about the United States' involvement in this, and how would you see the Obama administration, how they're responding to the Paris attacks and the whole situation there in Europe?
The French government elite are Obama on steroids, and we've heard his politically correct statements about Islam. It's very much the same in France. And this inability to say Muslim terror if you're on the left, phrases like these people aren't bad, they're just stupid, they need to be educated. You still see a lot of this in France, and this is why another attack is almost a certainty.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told an international audience of foreign diplomats that Israel stands with France. During the conference, which included the French ambassador, Netanyahu defined the enemy that Israel, France, and the world face today. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and French ambassador to Israel, Patrick Maisonneuve, stood shoulder to shoulder for a moment of silence to honor the victims of the Paris terror attacks. After the Paris attacks, Israel lowered its flags to half-mast. And now here on the streets of Jerusalem, the city is flying the French tricolor. Netanyahu and Maisonneuve spoke at the Jerusalem Post diplomatic conference in Jerusalem.
Terrorism is terrorism, not only when it affects us on such a horrendous scale, also, obviously, when it hits Israel.
During a Q&A, Netanyahu defined terrorism.
Terrorism is the deliberate and systematic targeting of the innocent. of civilians, of non-combatants, for political or ideological ends. This is what defines terrorism. It's always evil.
Netanyahu said the international community often tries to make excuses for Palestinians when they attack Israel. But Netanyahu said it's all the same.
The enemy is militant Islam. Its method, so far, is terrorism. It is in the business of acquiring states. One already exists. It's called the Islamic State of Iran. And the second is being established. It's called the Islamic State of ISIS, Daesh. And with states, the Islamist militants can have a base from which to launch much greater and more lethal terrorism.
The Prime Minister said there's only one way to fight militant Islam.
What is the system to fight them? One thing. Fight them. Condemn them. Identify, condemn, fight. I am saying that you're not going to change them. You will not win them over. You will not pacify them. The only way to defeat this is the way Nazism was defeated. First you defeat, then you denazify. That's the order. That's the priority.
Coming up, the former intelligence chief at the Defense Department says the Obama administration is underestimating the threat of ISIS. Even after the murderous attacks in Paris, President Barack Obama is saying his strategy against ISIS is working. Now his former intelligence chief at the Defense Department has a warning for the White House that it's underestimating the deadly ambitions of Islamic terrorists. George Thomas brings us this exclusive interview.
Retired General Michael Flynn has seen the face of radical Islam up close.
I will tell you, strategically, they are very savvy, they're very cunning, and they have the willingness to win.
General Flynn was President Obama's top man at the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Before that, the general served as Director of Intelligence for the Joint Special Operations Command, a shadowy arm of the government that tracks and eliminates terrorists around the world. The same unit, by the way, was responsible for the Commander raid that killed Osama bin Laden.
For the better half of a decade, Flynn has interrogated hundreds of Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorists.
The strategic leaders, they're not 25-year-old kids. These are like people that are, I would say, between the age of like 45 and 55, who are engineers, doctors, very intelligent. They should have better things to do, but they have this ingrained belief, and they mean to not only establish the caliphate, but dominate the world.
He says the Paris attacks serve as a reminder that the threat is unlikely to fade, and the sooner we understand that, the better.
So we have to get real, and this war that we are in, whether we like it or not, whether we accept the fact that we're in it or not, it is here in front of us.
On Monday, President Obama called the terror attacks in Paris a setback in the fight against ISIS, but is unwilling to send troops to Syria.
It is not just my view, but the view of my closest military and civilian advisors, that would be a mistake.
Flynn sees the real mistake as a White House that continues to underestimate the enemy and their religious ambitions. The general says Obama cannot win this war if he can't even name the enemy.
They see themselves as a component of Islam. This is a political ideology based on a religion. And we lost World War II to the Nazis. We'd be praying at the altar of Nazism today.
Flynn believes it's time the president and the world wake up, because what happened in Paris is the new norm, and we will see more of it.
This administration and the people that are around the president are poorly advising him on the kinds of things that we are facing, the type of enemy that we are facing.
In August 2014, Flynn was forced out of his job at the Defense Intelligence Agency for, among other things, his position that the Islamic terrorist threat was growing around the world and not receding like the administration wanted the public to believe.
And sadly, when the president says something, everybody else that's in our government has to sort of toe the line. Otherwise, you've got to leave the government, because if you can't toe the line, you're out. And you're looking at a guy that's out.
A registered Democrat, Flynn worries the Paris attacks are only fueling ISIS's recruiting and funding operations.
In under 3 weeks, General, ISIS has managed to blow up a Russian airliner, send suicide bombers into Lebanon, Baghdad, and now Paris. What does that tell you about their ambitions outside of Syria and Iraq?
Yeah, their ambitions are high. They believe they are winning. They are recruiting every time they do these operations.
4 years ago, the Islamic State did not exist. Now it controls vast swaths of Syria and Iraq, and 35 terror groups around the world have pledged allegiance to its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Flynn says we owe it to future generations to put a stop to this evil.
We've got to quit kidding ourselves, and the President of the United States needs to recognize that the absolutely failed policy that has been implemented by this administration to do anything about this is not absolutely, it's not achieving the mission.
George Thomas, CBN News.
Coming up, ISIS stunned Paris with its deadly terror attack, and now it's threatening to hit America. One author warns in a chilling scenario that the threat is all too real. After ISIS struck Paris, they released a video threatening to hit America. Here's a story we did about an author who presents a chilling scenario about how ISIS could use the same tactics that Hamas has used against Israel: terror tunnels. During the war, Hamas terrorists used an intricate series of tunnels to carry out sneak attacks. While IDF soldiers stopped those attacks, the tunnels shocked Israelis. At the time, CBN News chronicled their scope and size. The tunnels are designed to infiltrate Israeli communities like this one close to the border. Gaza is just about a mile that direction, and some of these tunnels are more than a mile long, 60 feet deep, with multiple exits. It proves that Hamas has been planning this for a very long time. Israel destroyed many of the tunnels, but the frightening memory remains. Dan Gordon, a veteran of 6 Israeli wars, talked about their effectiveness.
And I can't imagine anything more terrifying for the people who live there than the thought that suddenly the earth opens up, almost like a scene out of a grade B zombie movie, and the walking dead come out, except they're not dead. I've been a soldier now for 40 years, which is a long time. And the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen was the advent of the terrorist tunnel attacks that happened last summer.
Now, a year later, Gordon, an Israeli-American, has written Day of the Dead, a thriller about those tunnels. He says it should be a wake-up call to the U.S.
The country that's most vulnerable to that attack is my other homeland, the United States of America. And far more vulnerable because there are terrorist attack tunnels that exist already. They're called drug smuggling tunnels, and they run from parts of Mexico into California, to Arizona, and to Texas.
A former FBI agent warned recently that those tunnels could be used as an underground highway for ISIS. Gordon says the drug tunnels could make an unholy alliance between ISIS and the Mexican drug cartels.
They don't have to dig them, they just have to rent them. They have billions of dollars. That's a language that all the cartels understand.
Gordon says ISIS studied Hamas last summer.
They watched what Hamas did. They saw why it failed. They know how it can succeed. And what people don't realize is the Middle East, for ISIS, is their R&D lab. It's their Silicon Valley for what they intend to do to the United States.
He says southern border cities and towns like San Diego are vulnerable.
The reason the United States is so vulnerable to that, we don't have the surveillance over that border that Israel does. We don't have our most elite military units on constant patrol on the American-Mexican border. We have, if you want to talk about juicy targets for ISIS in San Diego, half the Pacific Fleet is at anchor in San Diego.
As an author, Gordon also wrote to entertain. One reviewer said Gordon gets into the mind of a terrorist like no one since Tom Clancy. But Gordon says it has things Clancy never included in his thrillers.
It's a big Tom Clancy, wonderful international espionage, great read. It's the first book that I know of that has a born-again Christian female graduate of Liberty University, female James Bond. At the heart of that book, the other thing is faith. At the heart of that book is something that you and I have both experienced together, which is you may think that you're in control, but the one who's in control at all times is the Almighty.
Gordon refutes the notion he's giving ideas to ISIS. He points out they've already got the blueprints. He says the U.S. needs to wake up to this clear and present danger.
I guarantee you there are people from ISIS right now who are examining U.S. cities. And like any military, there are numbers of hot young commanders who are saying, I have a great idea, and they're presenting their plans to the general staff of ISIS. One of those plans is going to get accepted, and one of those plans is going to get implemented. And if I'm looking at what's the most logical plan, it's in that book, Day of the Dead.
Up next, a Jewish film festival that's looking to reach out to the Christian community. Israeli filmmakers have been showcasing their films in and around Los Angeles during the 29th annual Israeli Film Festival. And as John Wagi explains, in the future, organizers hope to include more films about faith.
Organizers are happy with this year's turnout, and executive director of the festival, Mayor Flynn, says the films on display in Hollywood's backyard featured young filmmakers.
I can say in 29 years we never had so many first-time filmmakers that are, making a first feature film, and that's very interesting because you feel that there's a new upcoming industry, a new wave of younger filmmakers.
Flynn says the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the dominant theme in years past, but today's films deal with Israeli culture and tell stories. And while the films about faith are growing in the U.S., they're not so popular in Israel, the cradle of both Judaism and Christianity.
I don't know why. Maybe the Israelis are not so religious, at least they're filmmakers, so this is not such a topic that are interested.
But that may change. Flynn is already planning for next year's festival, the 30th anniversary, and he hopes to broaden the audience for Israel's films to include Christians.
We want to be more connected to the Christian community, and we're already there. We want to do a very special event with the Christian community to bring them in to see at least one Israeli film that will be right for them to watch and to bring them to be close to Israel.
John Wagi, CBN News, Encino, California.
Well, that's it for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Remember, you can follow us throughout the week on Facebook and Twitter. And because of the situation in the world and here in Israel, remember to pray for the people of France, the people here in Israel, the peace of Jerusalem, and for your hometown and country. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.